it for the audio, or you can even watch back. Giving players all the props, or put them on blast. We don't give no hot takes, only talk facts.
We're giving all our devotion, riding high on this wave of emotion. Going all out, yeah, cause this is our time. No, ain't no stopping us till we reach the finish line. All in, we came here to win. We're gonna give everything. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick. On fire, we're ready to fight. We'll bring the house down tonight. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick.
Play it on the car ride, play it when you lounge. X and O's, you know that we can hold it down. Shout out to my man Sammy, got it off the ground. And to all the listeners tuned in right now, got debates, analysis, and speculation. This is sports talk for the new generation. You know where to find us, got a reputation. Sick podcast, your #1 sports destination.
Giving all our devotion, riding high on this wave of emotion. Going all out, yeah, cause this is our time. No, ain't no stopping us till we reach the finish line. All in, we came here to win. We're gonna give everything. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick. On fire, we're ready to fight. We'll bring the house down tonight. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick.
S-I-C-K, it's the sickest podcast. Tune in for the audio, or you can even watch back. Giving players all the props, or put them on blast. We don't give no hot takes, only talk back. S-I-C-K, 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 S-I-C-K,
All in, we came here to win. We're gonna give everything. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick.
S-I-C-K, it's the sickest podcast. Tune in for the audio, or you can even watch back. Giving players all the props, or put them on blast. We don't give no hot takes, only talk facts.
We're giving all our devotion, riding high on this wave of emotion. Going all out, yeah, cause this is our time. No, ain't no stopping us till we reach the finish line. All in, we came here to win. We're gonna give everything. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick. On fire, we're ready to fight. We'll bring the house down tonight. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick.
Play it on the car ride, play it when you lounge. X and O's, you know that we can hold it down. Shout out to my man Sammy, got it off the ground. And to all the listeners tuned in right now, got debates, analysis, and speculation. This is sports talk for the new generation. You know where to find us, got a reputation. Sick podcast, your #1 sports destination.
Giving all our devotion, riding high on this wave of emotion. Going all out, yeah, cause this is our time. No, ain't no stopping us till we reach the finish line. All in, we came here to win. We're gonna give everything. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick. On fire, we're ready to fight. We'll bring the house down tonight. S-I-C-K on the run. S-I-C-K, sick.
S-I-C-K, it's the sickest podcast. Tune in for the audio, or you can even watch back. Giving players all the props, or put them on blast. We don't give no hot takes, only talk back. S-I-C-K, 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 S-I-C-K.
Turn up your volume. Because you're about to listen to The Sick Podcast. With Tony Marinaro.
55 seconds left in the penalty, a minute and 27 seconds left in regulation time. Boston 4, Montreal 3. Lafleur coming out rather gingerly on the right side. He gives it into Lemaire, back to Lafleur. Oh!
The sickest Montreal Canadiens podcast.
You're in the ball!
Sports entertainment like no other.
Rejoint, on lui fait perdre la rondelle, une passe devant. Et c'est le dégagement et ce sera la victoire des Canadiens. Stanley pour les Canadiens, leur 23e de l'histoire.
You found the dogs! John, you found the dogs! He found the dogs! And all together, they worked a young team to the top. And now, a 24th Stanley Cup banner will hang from the rafters of the famous Forum in Montreal. The Canadiens win the Stanley Cup!
Brought to you by Energy Transportation Group. Driven to be different. La Vida Tibi. Embrace your true nature. And Playground, your premier gaming destination. It's gonna be sick.
Marinaro, the Sick Podcast on this Wednesday night. It is August 2nd, and the Sick Podcast brought to you in part by Energy Transportation Group, a leading full-service logistics provider serving all of North America, driven to be different. Also brought to you in part by Playground. Over 600 machines, poker tournaments, and playground casino games, daily promotions, and unmatched customer service. Why go anywhere else? Located just over the Mercier Bridge, only minutes from downtown Montreal. Playground and brewed in Quebec, and a winner of a dozen international awards. La Bittt at Tibi offers quality microbrewery beers made with premium ingredients for everyone's taste. La Bittt at Tibi, embrace your true nature. Today, you know what? I came across a couple of articles. And one of the guys who's been writing a lot of articles about the Montreal Canadiens in the last week or so, especially, I don't know, this guy, he's spitting out articles pretty much every day or every other day, is Ryan Szporer, columnist at The Hockey Writer, and he joins me right now. Ryan, what's going on?
Not much. How are you?
Very, very well. Thanks for doing this, my man. And there's 3 articles that I wouldn't say caught my attention, but I think we're going to focus on right now. That's an article regarding Ylonen. It's another article regarding Lias Andersson, and one regarding the possibility of the Montreal Canadiens making the playoffs. Why don't we start with Ylonen, who's a former second-round pick, 35th overall by the Montreal Canadiens back in the 2018 draft. Here's a guy who split last season between Laval and Montreal. So he's got a chance. You know, you would evaluate his chances of making the team probably at 50-50, maybe actually less than 50% because of the contract situation going around with other players on the team. So here it is. As we bring up the graphic, in case you missed it, Ylonen just signed a great extension, at least great for the Montreal Canadiens, you say. 2-way deal at what cost? Let's dive into it. Let's discuss it. What do you tell me?
Yeah, so Ylonen resigned at, I believe, the league minimum, $775K for one season, after which he becomes a restricted free agent. But the 2-way nature of it entails that he's only going to make $200K in the AHL. The catch is that he's also no longer waiver exempt. So if he is cut during training camp, which is, in my opinion, what's going to happen based on the contract situation, he can be picked off waivers by another team, and the Canadiens would lose him. And it would be a shame, because I think if you look at, for example, where he would fit in the lineup based on the makeup of his player profile, he probably is a bottom 6 forward at this stage of his career, a play driving one at that, but a bottom 6 forward. And Yoel Armia, Ylonen outproduced Yoel Armia, who probably has one of the worst contracts on the team.
Yeah.
But because of the veteran nature, because of the fact Armia is a veteran, and you can't really get rid of that contract, and the aforementioned logjam up front, it's unlikely that Ylonen would be able to usurp Armia and others.
It's always, it's not an easy exercise when you look at a player and you say, this player is a first-line player, this player is a second-line player, this player is a third-line player, this player is a fourth-line player. There are players who can surprise you. But one of the things you can do that'll help you out is just take a look at their body of work. And if you take a look at Ylonen's body of work, He's never really put up huge numbers, all right? So last year he had 11 goals in 39 games in the American Hockey League. He had 6 goals in 37 games in the National Hockey League. His goal is 6 goals in 37 games in the National Hockey League would translate to what? 12 in 74, so probably about 15 or so in an 82-game season. That doesn't make you a first-line player. It doesn't make you a second-line player. I think a lot of people probably see him as a fourth-line player, but this is where I think it could become interesting because Jesse Ylonen can probably end up playing a role on a third line if you want your third line to be a shutdown line. Now, there's 2 different schools of thought, Ryan, right? There's either you go with 4 lines that obviously your best players play on the top lines, but you try and have, you can put an offensive player or 2 on line 3 or line 4 and ask for everyone to produce, or you end up going top 2 line heavy in terms of offense, create a shutdown line on the third line, and create a line that goes out and maybe has bigger bodies, takes the body and provides some energy to the team, an energy line. This school of thought used to exist a lot more 10, 15, 20 years ago than it does now, but you can still win that way. And you see a lot of teams that win the Stanley Cup, usually they end up having that kind of formula. They end up having a fourth line, which is big. They take the body, they go out, they bring energy. Where would you see Ylonen? Would you see him more on a third line or on a fourth line at the NHL level?
I think it depends on how the team in question is made up. On the Canadiens, as they're made up right now, he would be a fourth liner because they, in my estimation, they're going more along the lines of the first formula that you pointed out. The ability to maybe roll 4 lines with offensive players. I think the acquisition of Alex Newhook, the re-signing of Sean Monahan, all that plays into that line of thinking, in my estimation.
All right. So if we take a look at your top 12 off the top of your head, and you can end up having 13, you might even end up having 14, but your top 12 off the top of your head without actually saying on which lines they're going to go on, who do you have?
I'm going to be cheating because I do have an organizational depth chart over here, but
don't worry about it. Go for it.
I would say Cole Caulfield, Nick Suzuki, Kirby Duck, Alex Newhook, Sean Monahan, Uri Slavkovsky,
Dvorak
would be probably the third line center.
Gallagher.
I think at this point, yes. Let's say Brendan Gallagher over Mike Hoffman for number 12, for number 9, and Mike Hoffman would make it. Yoel Armia, Pizzetta, and Evans.
Yeah. No Raphael Harvey Pinard.
Yes, Raphael Harvey Pinard over Pizzetta for sure.
Over Pizzetta for sure. All right, okay. So that's the way you don't look at Michael Pizzetta being an everyday player at the Montreal Canadiens. You look at him being a 13 or a 14.
I see him as being an everyday roster player, but yes, probably a number 13 who gets in there every few games or so.
And, although he is getting better, he is the type of player that if he's out of the lineup every now and then, he's not going to disrupt the chemistry on the team, in the locker room. He's not going to ruffle any feathers. Here's a guy that's still going to be very enjoyable to be around. And, look, he's still young. Pizzetta can get better. Ideally, the role that the player that would be 13 or 14 that's out of the lineup every now and then would probably have been more suited for a Belzile, who would go on 32 years old. But in this case, you'd have to think it would be Pizzetta, unless, of course, they want to do it to a Hoffman or they want to do it to an Armia, but you would think they're not going to do that. Hoffman's contract's up at the end of the year. Armia's got 1 more year left. You want to get something for these players going forward.
I would humbly disagree in the sense that I've actually written a recent article also on the situation regarding Hoffman specifically. suggesting that the Canadiens should throw caution to the wind and bury his contract. All due respect to him, because I don't think Hoffman's done anything wrong. I just feel like the Canadiens are in a position where they're best served giving his roster spot to someone like Ylonen, for example. And if you look at what happened last season under similar circumstances with Evgeny Dadonov, they got Denis Gurianov back, and that really didn't translate into much of anything. And Hoffman doesn't really have much value right now. I don't envision him building up his trade value to the point where the Canadiens would get anything more than a third, fourth round pick at the trade deadline. And you have to question whether or not that third or fourth round pick is more valuable than the development of someone like Ylonen or Harvey Pinard, who is still waiver exempt and could be sent down easily to make room for someone with a veteran with a contract still.
Yeah, when you talk about Hoffman, it's interesting because the Canadiens have talked about culture for the longest time, and you just get the feeling that Hoffman and the way he plays the game, I'm not so sure he fits into that culture.
I think that the Canadiens didn't get exactly what they hoped for when they signed him. I thought they were probably looking for someone to be a boon to the power play. And, they basically signed him to replace Thomas Tatar. And I don't think they got that really. Hoffman's defensive reputation or, lack thereof regarding his defensive capabilities, they were going for a sniper and someone to, again, boost the power play. But the power play has been horrible the 2 years he's been here. And that's not all on him, obviously. He's a complimentary player. But you can't really say it's worked out all the same. He just, I wouldn't say he's a bad fit culturally. I would just say he's just been a bad fit in general. And he was probably signed to help with push the Canadiens into the playoffs following their Stanley Cup final run and kind of help the team get over the hump in that sense. But I don't think that was ever going to work out because the Atlantic Division was reforming. You had lost Shea Weber. Carey Price got injured. That team had everything stacked against them from the get-go, and Hoffman wasn't going to help out in that regard.
A shout out to Murphy Clinic, an aesthetic clinic specializing in medical aesthetic care. They offer permanent laser hair removal as well as a wide range of treatments for skin problems such as acne, rosacea, fine lines, and more. They currently have 2 clinics, one located in Montreal Shop Angus and the second on the North Shore in Terrebonne. They're also opening soon in Quebec Cité. Visit murphyclinic.ca or on Instagram at Murphy Clinic. If anyone ever drops by, say hello to the lovely Pamela and staff. Pamela is an absolute dear. Their service is top-notch. Their technology is top-notch. And I can tell you that the family goes to Murphy Clinic. Merci beaucoup pour tout votre expertise. Thank you very much for all of your expertise. All right, okay. Ylonen. The fact that you don't have him in your top 12, you don't have him in your top 13, maybe not even in your top 14. My question to you is it strictly because of others' contract situations, or do you think they're just better players than him?
It's all due to the contract situation with Hoffman, Armia, even Gallagher. And I love Gallagher, but he's probably best suited to a bottom 6 role at this stage.
Well, hold on a second. This is interesting. So do you think that at this stages of their career, that Jesse Ylonen, if granted the same amount of minutes, let's just say the Canadiens gave Jesse Ylonen 10 minutes in the bottom 6, 12 minutes in the bottom 6, and they gave Brendan Gallagher the exact same thing, 10 to 12 minutes in the bottom 6, that Ylonen could bring more to the table than Gallagher. Are you saying that?
No, I think Gallagher would still bring more. I'm saying more so with regard to Hoffman and Armia, because Ylonen did outproduce Armia last season. That can't be denied.
Yeah.
And Hoffman, he's more of a top 6 forward. You can't really put him in the bottom 6 without unexpect much. If Hoffman were a bottom 6 forward, I'd make that bet as well in Ylonen's favor, but that it's kind of a moot point because Hoffman's never going to be played in the bottom six or the bottom line anyway. That's where Ylonen, I think, would shine right now with less expectations.
I'm not so sure about that, Ryan, because if Mike Hoffman at one point ends up in Marty St. Louis' doghouse, now listen, it's funny I'm saying this because I have a different school of thought, okay? I see things a little bit differently than everyone. That's why a lot of people say I know absolutely nothing. I think I know a lot. But anyway, joke. Not. I like trying to get something for players who are not in your plans, especially in the final year of their contract. And that's the time to boost their value. And I've said on more than one occasion that even though the best winger for Suzuki and Caulfield, until proven otherwise, is Doc. Doc was amazing last year. Now they want to play him at center. I agree. I have no problem with that. In that case, you'd think that the best winger for those two guys would be Josh Andersson, a guy who could be there, insulate them, protect them, go into the corners, do some work, yada, yada, yada. But I don't think they're going to do that either. And, or maybe they will. What am I getting at? In the final year of your contract, I like to raise your value as much as possible. I want to put you in a winning situation. I wouldn't mind putting Hoffman with those two guys for half the season. And I wouldn't mind putting Monahan with those two guys for half the season because they're both in the final year of their contract and you can both get something for them if they pick up points. And their best chance of picking up points is playing with those two guys and playing on the power play. Is that going to happen? I mean, only time will tell. We'll find out in the second week of October.
I would see the thing about that is, and this is purely speculation on my part, I will readily admit that the Canadiens seem to want to make the playoffs. And I think their best bet to do that is to put Caulfield and Suzuki with the player with whom they had the most success last season, and that's Doc. I think they resigned Monahan just so they could put Doc on that first line and put Monahan back on that second line as center.
Elaborate on that for me, please, if you can. When you say the Canadiens seem to want to make the playoffs, you believe Kent Hughes, that's the goal, is to make the playoffs right away in the 23-24 season. You believe that's the goal for Jeff Gordon. We know the coach always wants to win as many games as possible. We know that, right? The coach wants to go 82-0 and then go 16-0 in the playoffs and obviously win the Stanley Cup. We get that. Does the GM and the executive vice president of hockey operations, do they want to continue with the rebuild? If the answer is no, then they want to make the playoffs. If the answer is yes at all costs, then they're going to want to finish in the bottom five. If the answer is somewhat, well, then maybe they'll try. But if they come up short, it's not the end of the world.
I think that the goal is to make a run at a playoff spot, to be in the mix at the trade deadline. And I think we've discussed this in the past, where if they're in the mix at the trade deadline and Monahan is being as valuable as he proved to be last season, there's no reason to trade him in the last year of his contract because he's contributing to a potentially locking down a playoff berth. I don't think that's going to happen in the end. I think they're going to be in the mix at the trade deadline and ultimately fall short. But that would be counterintuitive if you're within reach of a playoff spot. And the same goes for Hoffman, really, if he's, in that top 6, top 9.
All right. Okay. So now on to Lias Andersson. And I want to talk to you about him. Let's bring up a graphic of your piece so everyone can see it. And of course, you can follow Ryan Szporer on Twitter at RSZPORER. All right. Columnist at the Hockey Writer. Lias Andersson doesn't realistically have an inside track to a Canadiens roster spot like some may think. Why not?
It's a similar issue with Ylonen. Andersson signed a two-way contract, so it's easy for the Canadiens to demote him because they're going to be paying him less in the AHL, and just the sheer symbolism of the two-way contract. It's indicative of the Canadiens not necessarily having that most confidence in him. Now, to be fair, and I pointed this out in the piece, and I think everyone knows at this point, it's no surprise that Jeff Gorton drafted Andersson the same year that, the Golden Knights drafted Nick Suzuki, and, the Canadiens ultimately acquired him.
7th overall in 2017. The draft of Nico Hischier first, Nolan Patrick second, Heiskanen third, Makar fourth, Elias Pettersson fifth, Cody Glass to Vegas sixth, and Lias Andersson to the New York Rangers seventh. Continue, Ryan.
Yeah, so Gordon obviously believes in Andersson, because otherwise he wouldn't have given him, he wouldn't give him a contract through GM Kent Hughes, with the Canadiens. But all that having been said, realistically, Andersson still has so much to prove before he can become an everyday NHL forward. Forget even like a top six, which, him having been drafted where he was, you'd expect him to be. But no, the Canadiens' top six is, for all intents and purposes, set. I mean, parts can move from one line to another, but the Canadiens simply don't have room for Andersson, especially seeing as he's primarily a center, ideally a center. You've got Suzuki, you've got Monahan, you've got Dvorak, you've got Evans. And, that's not even taking into account the fact that Doc can play center, Newhook can play center. Where's he going to play? He's coming off a very good AHL season. And I have to believe, logically, that the Canadiens signed him thinking that's where he's probably going to play the most, with the promise of him being one of the, first call-ups in the event of injuries. And if that happens, if Andersson is playing in the top six on the Montreal Canadiens because of injuries, that means a lot of things have gone wrong from an injury perspective for a third straight season. So it isn't exactly, it wouldn't be good, all things considered.
If you're watching right now, you're watching on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. And of course, you can listen to us on Google, Apple, and Spotify. If you're watching, like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Comment SICK, SICK, SICK. And if you're listening, leave us a 5-star review. It's our way of feeling the love. At least I hope so. This whole Lias Andersson thing I find it extremely intriguing, and I'm going to tell you why. Lias Andersson, once again, was a player that was identified by Jeff Gorton, you would think, as a big potential player. He drafted him 7th overall. It's the same draft where, Owen Tippett went 10th, and Velarde went 11th, and Nishkash went 12th, and Suzuki went 13th. And, the list goes on and on. Josh Norris went 19th. Robert Thomas went 20th. There's some pretty good players. I think what we talked about before is the rebuild over, yes or no, has a lot to do with what can happen with Lias Andersson. To begin with, you're right. There's no doubt that players' contracts, when a player has a two-way compared to a player who's got a one-way, the player who's got the one-way is in the driver's seat, and the player who's in the two-way is not. So you would think that just based on that, the one-way starts in Montreal, the two-way chances are he's going to Laval. However, let's say Lias Andersson shows up to camp and he blows away Jake Evans, and he's even better than Christian Dvorak. Here's a guy who last year at the American Hockey League level picked up 31 goals in 67 games, 59 points in 67 games, 3 points in 2 playoff games. This player can produce points. Maybe not earlier on in his career, with the exception of a year in, I think it was Sweden, but definitely showed last season that he can. 100% that he can. So, let's go back to it again. If Andersson can bring more to the table than Evans, can produce more than Evans, and the Canadiens want to make the playoffs and the rebuild is over, he's got his chance. But if the rebuild is not over and they don't care if they don't make the playoffs, even if Andersson is better than Evans, at that point, you can still have Evans here and you got Andersson helping your American Hockey League team, who, by the way, is going to need some help and going to need some offense. You would think this guy's going to be the number one centerman on that team to start the season next season. Right?
I mean, it's all dependent on how Andersson shows up in training camp. I mean, I think we can agree on that. Even if I think it would take a Herculean effort on his part to usurp either Evans or Dvorak, honestly. I just don't see it happening based on the conservative nature of the Canadiens, traditionally speaking.
You're pulling out some words tonight. Herculean, usurp, aforementioned. I can tell that you're a writer and I'm not. Like you're remind me never to play you in a game of Scrabble, my friend. It's never going to happen. I think it would be over before it even started.
I'll remind you.
Okay, on to your third column if we can, but not before I talk to you about sportbuffshop.com. Shop all your sports licensed lifestyle apparel, including hoodies, caps, and t-shirts of your favorite teams from all major leagues at sportbuffshop.com. Use code SICK10 for 10% off on all of their items. And here's your last piece that we'll get to. The Canadiens can realistically compete for a playoff spot in 23-24, even if one ultimately falls out of reach thanks to some combination of the following 5 obstacles in front of them. Ryan, what are those obstacles?
Okay, number 5 is a lack of experience, in the sense that they just traded away Joel Edmondson, who was one of their, part of the leadership core. And, it remains to be seen how much of a factor this is, because the Canadiens are a younger team, but 2 teams that were younger than them to end the year, the Los Angeles Kings and the New Jersey Devils, made the playoffs, and Devils obviously enjoyed great success, even reaching the second round. So it's kind of it's more so one of those intangibles, and depends on where you fall, assessing the old school nature of that quality.
They clearly don't have as much experience as they had a couple of years ago when they made the final. Point taken, granted, 100%. They lost a lot of veteran leadership, by the way, from that team. That Shea Weber was on that team that made it to the Stanley Cup final. He's not. Joel Edmondson was on that team that made it to the Stanley Cup final. He's not. Ben Sherratt was on that team that made it to the Stanley Cup final. He's not. Gustafsson was on that team that made it to the Cup final. Merrill was on that team that made it to the Cup final. Stahl was on that team that made it to the Cup final. Danault was on that team that made it to the Cup final. And I'm going off the top of my head here, but there are others that not thinking about right now, but we're on that team that made it to the Cup final. Tatar was on that team that made it to the Cup final. Was he not?
He didn't play much, but yeah.
No, he didn't play. Lehkonen was on that team that made it to the Cup final.
Scored the clinching goal in round 3.
Yeah, on Saint Jean Baptiste, by the way, on Saint Jean Baptiste. And now I'm going to hold on a second. So I'm going to do this now. I'm going to bring it up here. I want to take a look to see if there's anyone that I missed out on. Okay, who else? Drouin was on that team. Yes, Corey Perry was on that team. Of course, how can I forget Corey Perry? And Jeff Petrie was on that team that made it to the Cup final. Tyler Toffoli was on that team that made it to the Cup final. Paul Byron was on that team that made it to the Cup final. There's a lot of players. Brett Kulak was on that team that made it to the Cup final. They lost a lot of experience in 2 years, eh? You really get a better feel for it once you start taking a look at the team on paper and stuff. Man, they lost a lot of experience.
They did, but I think overall, I'd say the team is going to be better, but I think the team as it was then the success hinged largely on Carey Price, and they obviously don't have a Carey Price in net right now. And I'm not so sure that's a bad thing because of the contract, and you don't really want to pay your goalies $10.5 million per year, or at least have a cap hit of $10.5 million per year.
No, you don't need a top goalie to win the Stanley Cup now. You just need one to get hot in the playoffs.
Yeah, but even so, I mean, it would be nice to have above average goaltending. And that's another one of the obstacles that I discuss in the piece, in the sense that I believe Samuel Montembeault has stolen number one job from Jake Allen for all intents and purposes.
I agree with you.
But he's still a huge question mark in net because he played absolutely well. There's no denying he played very well last season.
Yeah.
And you for proof of that, you can look just to like goal saved above expected as, one of the analytics that says he was among the league leaders in that stat, which is incredibly impressive. That having been said, if you look at just the normal statistics, not so good. I believe he had an average mediocre for all intents and purposes, 901 save percentage, and his goals against average was well above 3. That's more indicative of the team in front of him. I'll readily admit. Even so, it was just 2 years ago that he was a third stringer, and he was thrust into starters territory last season because of all the injuries, and he didn't really play nearly as well as he did last year. So he still has a lot to prove, and no one can say for sure if he's a flash in the pan or not. And I think that it's a good thing that the Canadiens have low expectations for this coming season, because it gives them the chance to give him the reins and see what he's got. And, if he doesn't, he's a pending unrestricted free agent, in which case don't resign him and sign someone new. It's easier than it sounds. I mean, that there's no telling who they'll be able to get via free agency, but right now I think that's the only solution. The only thing that they can do is to give him the net, Montembeault, and see how he does and reassess before signing him to a new contract, if at all.
All right. Okay. So one obstacle is the lack of experience that can get in the way of making the playoffs. The other obstacle is Samuel Montembeault, in your opinion, has surpassed Jake Allen, but he is still somewhat of a question mark. I think he's a question mark if you want to put him up against the top 7 or 8 goalies in the National Hockey League. But other than that, I don't think he's a question mark. Other obstacles. What do you have at number 3? Was the goalie situation obstacle number 4, by the way, on your in your column? Or
no, it was number 3. Number 4 was just kind of external pressure on Kent Hughes to continue the rebuild and not go for it. And we alluded to this earlier about with regard to Monahan, for example. If the Canadiens are in a position to at least make a run of clinching a playoff berth, there's no logical reason to trade away Monahan at the deadline, because you're in a position to potentially make it. So
this is interesting, because a year ago, if Monahan was healthy and they knew they were in the rebuild, even if they're in a playoff spot, come deadline, the day before the deadline, I believe they trade him. At this stage of where they are with the rebuild and about ready to turn the corner, if they're in a playoff spot the day before the deadline or the day of the deadline, I believe they would not trade Monahan.
I agree. And I think that's just my inclination, and it's what I believe Hughes will do, not to trade him. That having been said, there are a lot of calls for the Canadiens to continue, the rebuild for what is, even go so far as to tank this coming season for another high pick. And in such an instance, who knows what goes on in Hughes' head. Do you trade Monahan? Do you trade Hoffman if he's performing well at the deadline? It remains to be seen.
Add the word inclination to the list of very big and long words that Ryan Szporer has thrown out in this podcast. Usurp, aforementioned, inclination. Which one was the other one again?
I don't remember. Am I going to get invited back?
You definitely will. I told you I'll invite you back on the podcast 100%. But at 200%, I'm not playing a game of Scrabble with you. Like, that is not happening. Never. Like, don't call me up and say, Tony, you know what? I got some free time. You got some free time. You want to play Scrabble? No. If I have some free time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my iPhone and I'm going to play checkers. Okay? Because I do it. As a matter of fact, I play about 30 minutes of checkers every day. All right? Okay? So here we are. Right there. You see? Okay? Play that every day. One player. I got the difficulty in between normal and hard. Okay. So this is what I do when I have some free time. Do you play force jump or not?
I don't play checkers.
You don't play checkers.
I do not.
You play chess.
I play more chess than checkers, but I wouldn't say I play chess either.
All right. Okay. So this whole time you've been playing chess and I've been playing checkers. Is that what you're telling me here or what?
This whole time I've been playing Scrabble.
You've been playing Scrabble. All right. Obstacle number 2 in the way of the Canadiens making the playoffs is?
It's another injury-plagued season, because you have to look back to the first month of last season where the Canadiens were at one point, early November, I believe, holding down the 8th spot. And they were playing well, and I don't think anyone could take that away. It wasn't like just the goaltenders stealing victories, although they were playing well themselves. The Canadiens as a whole were gelling as a unit, and I feel like another year of experience under the belts of their younger players. If Montembeault, takes that extra next step in his development, I think that the Canadiens are, again, in that mix. But if that all goes, that all hits the fan if injuries strike like they did the last 2 seasons when they led the league in man games lost, both the last 2 seasons. The Canadiens just don't have the organizational depth to offset injuries to that degree, and that's been proven the last 2 seasons.
So the depth is the other obstacle in your opinion.
Yes, I do think they have the players to roll 4 lines in principle, but only past that point, not so much. After that point, there's a lot of unproven talent in the system, and you're going to run into a situation where you've got Harry Pinard and Ylonen flanking Nick Suzuki on the first line again, and you can't really have that to make the playoffs.
All right, okay. Obstacle number 1.
It's the competition in stacked Atlantic division, because there are maximum 5 spots up for grabs, and I don't know who realistically drops out, seeing as the wild card Florida Panthers are coming off a Stanley Cup final appearance. I don't see the Toronto Maple Leafs falling out of it. I don't see the Tampa Bay Lightning falling out of it. And even though Patrice Bergeron just retired, I don't see the Boston Bruins falling out of it. So then you're down to 1 spot hypothetically. And I don't know if the Canadiens are good enough to steal it away from the Detroit Red Wings, the Buffalo Sabres, the Ottawa Senators. And that's only if that final 5th spot is even up for grabs and not taken by someone in the Metropolitan Division.
All right, so let's look at that. As a matter of fact, I want to bring that up. So I want to bring up the teams that made the playoffs last year in the East. Okay, so here you have it in the East. So Boston, Carolina, New Jersey, Toronto, the Rangers, Tampa Bay, the Islanders, and the Florida Panthers. Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Ottawa, Detroit, Washington, Philadelphia, Montreal, and Columbus. These are the teams that did not make it, okay? The Penguins were 1 point out of a playoff spot. So were the Sabres. Ottawa was 5 points out of a playoff spot. So let's just pretend that the teams that didn't make the playoffs last year won't make the playoffs this year either. If the teams that didn't make the playoffs last year won't make the playoffs this year either, which team in the playoffs can miss the playoffs? And I would say the Islanders. I would say if there's a team that was in a playoff spot last year in the East that I could see missing the playoffs this year, if, I'm not saying they will, if there is, it would be the Islanders. What do you think?
I think that's a fair bet. I believe the Panthers had fewer points than them, but between the two, I'd say
one fewer point, one less point.
So I'd say between the two, the Islanders are the obvious choice, just based on the playoff success that the Panthers just had. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Having said that, let's just say the Islanders missed the playoffs, and one of the teams that actually missed the playoffs last year would make the playoffs. Who would that team be? You'd have to think that Pittsburgh and Buffalo, who came close last year within a point, they would still be the teams right now anyway that have the best shot of getting into a playoff spot. Don't you think? Out of the teams that missed the playoffs last year. And once again, they are Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Ottawa, Detroit, Washington, Philadelphia, Montreal, and Columbus. Do you think that Pittsburgh and Buffalo would have the best shot of getting in?
It's hard to say. I'd say, that's what one might assume based on how the season shook out last season. Between Buffalo, Detroit, Ottawa, it's a relative crapshoot in my opinion. I think that there are pros and cons for either one of them. If I had to pick one, I'd say the Red Wings because I'm not going to bet against Yzerman.
Then again, think about this. The Canadiens were 24 points out of a playoff spot last year, okay? 24.
Okay.
They were the team that lost the most man games due to injury. 24 points is 12 wins. 12 wins more last year, they would have got in. 12 wins is what? The month of October, November, December, January, February, March, April. It's about 6.5 months. Put 2 wins per month more. If the Canadiens' man games lost from injury go from 750 games to 250 games, let's just say, can they not win 2 games per month more?
I think so.
So you know what? The Canadiens can be there. You're right. You talked about the obstacles, but in a perfect season, in an ideal situation, the Canadiens are going to battle for a playoff spot. I believe so. Then again, there's also some teams that didn't make it last year who are going to be better. But I think there were some teams that got in last year who might still be in, but they're going to drop points. I think the Canadiens. I said the other day, I wasn't willing to say right away if the Canadiens were going to make the playoffs or not. I'm going to wait till, the night before the first game of the season. But I'm willing to say this. They're not going to finish bottom 5. And tonight I'm going to say something else. They're not going to finish bottom 8 in the league either. So they're not going to finish bottom 5. They're not going to finish bottom 8. I'm willing to say that. And between now and the beginning of the season, I might end up, giving them even more points than that. Hey, Ryan, it was a lot of fun. Tell people where they can find you on Twitter at @Szporer. I'll tell them actually RSZPORER. And you're a columnist for the Hockey Writers.
Correct.
Very good to talk to you again, my man. And we'll talk to you soon. All right.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. There you have it. There's Ryan Szporer. I'm Marinaro. Once again, you can listen to us on Google, Apple, or Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's absolutely free. Check us out. We go live weeknights on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter for Agnello, Sammy, and Juliana at Master Control. There, Cavallaro. I'm Marinaro. Good night. A demain, a domani. Talk tomorrow. Ciao for now.
And that's a wrap. Hope you don't miss us too much until next time. Follow the Sick Podcast with Tony Marinaro on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts. The Sick Podcast is brought to you by Energy Transportation Group, driven to be different. LaBita.tb. Embrace your true nature. And Playground, your premier gaming destination.